All right, Richard. One question first.
If it's about Norman, you know the answer. No court in the world, no power under heaven can force me to give up my son.
He is not your son.
Why do I always find myself forgetting about this one? Probably because it's the last thing you think of when you hear the phrase Titanic movie. I tend to think of the ones that are really historically accurate or the ones that are horrendously bad. And this one sort of falls somewhere in the middle. The Titanic herself is usually the main character in every piece of media if it's done well. When you don't, the Titanic just becomes the setting, and you wonder why use the Titanic? If you could set it anywhere else, you kind of look as though you're trying to cash in on something that's popular. Especially if your story isn't that great and it doesn't address the philosophical, political or economic themes surrounding the Titanic. Hell, I bet you could put the plot of this movie on the Lusitania and it wouldn't change a thing, except possibly the nationality of the characters. It was really hard to say anything about this film, really. I couldn't make the whole video making fun of dumbass Norman, so I've had a wee look-see around the background of this movie, and its background is actually more interesting than the film itself. I'll go through them once I've summarised the plot, because I don't know how many people have actually seen this movie. The story of 1953 Titanic is as follows. We have the Sturgis family. The mother, Julia, played by Barbara Stanwyck, turns out the W isn't silent, boarding at Cherbourg with her daughter Annette, aged 18, played by Audrey Dalton, and her son, dumbass Norman, played by Harper Carter. If you're wondering why I called him that, let's just say he'll be seeing this guy soon enough.
Stupid deaths, they're funny 'cause they're true. Woo! Stupid deaths, hope next time it's not you.
The pretense of this journey is to visit Julia's relatives in Michigan, but in actual fact, she's taking them away from the high society American expatriate life in Europe, where they've been spoiled rotten by their father. Julia wants them to live in Michigan like real Americans and walk to school for a damn change. Julia herself came from a common background, for lack of a better term. She's proud of being common and has often gotten into fights with her husband, over him trying to make her more high class. Speaking of whom, the father, Richard Sturgis, is played by Clifton Webb. He learned of Julia's plan at the last minute and rushes to Cherbourg to get on the Titanic with them. Here we have our first major inaccuracy. Richard has to bribe his way onto the Titanic because he can't just buy a first-class ticket. Apparently it's sold out, when we all know that was not true. And I hate this bloody falsity being used over and over again, even as late as 2012.
But there's a waiting list, sir. And several passengers in first wanted a larger cabin if one came free.
I'm coming for you, fellows. To get on the Titanic, Richard convinces a Basque family to give them one of their tickets and hands them enough money to buy land in California and start a vineyard. The mother and children embark as steerage, while the father stays behind. That's all the focus there is on the steerage passengers in this film. Anyway, Richard gets on the ship and saunters up to first class, where J.J. Astor lends him a change of clothes, and he joins Julia, Annette and Norman. Richard makes every attempt to sabotage Julia, indirectly revealing it to Annette, so she decides she'll go back to Paris with her father when they get to New York. Julia concedes that she cannot change Annette's mind, because she's practically an adult, but insists that she keep dumbass Norman. Richard refuses to give up his son, and that is when Julia says,
"He is not your son."
Julia had an affair in the heat of the moment years ago. Richard, disgusted, distances himself from dumbass Norman and spends the rest of the voyage playing bridge in the first-class smoking room, despite Julia's pleas. Annette, meanwhile, starts a romance with a varsity tennis player from Purdue. He's on his way home with his teammates, helping the rather shy and guarded Annette come out of her shell. Her mother permits it because he's a nice American lad, someone she might want to stay in America for. When the iceberg strikes, everything boils over. Richard lets go of his stubbornness after urging the captain for the truth about the ship's fate. He goes down to steerage and fetches the Basque family before seeing Julia, Annette and dumbass Norman into a lifeboat. They forgive each other just before it gets lowered away. And this is where dumbass Norman lives up to his name. This was based on the story of a Mexican passenger, Manuel Uruchurtu Ramirez. Did I say that right? Oh my god. I took Spanish for GCSE, I should know this, but I didn't like my Spanish teacher. He was an arsehole. Anyway, Ramirez was said to have given up his seat to another passenger and died in the sinking. As the boat lowers, an old woman rushes to get on, but the crewman stops her, telling her it's full. So what does dumbass Norman do? He gets out so she can have the spot. Look, it's one thing for a 39-year-old man to do that as an act of chivalry. Obviously, Norman didn't know the ship was sinking, but still, a little too bold for his own good, don't you think? And that old woman, she is so lucky Twitter wasn't a thing in 1912, or she would have been cancelled to hell and back for letting a little boy go off and die. I'm surprised Julia didn't throttle her. It's realised only too late that dumbass Norman is gone by Julia and Annette, and that fear from Julia, that's actually real. When they were filming the scene, Barbara Stanwyck was terrified the entire time because they were suspended several feet above a giant tank, and she feared the ropes might snap. So this was pretty much all her anxiety building up at once and overspilling. Dumbass Norman finds Richard, who embraces him as his son, and people gather on the deck and sing Nearer My God to Thee as the ship goes under. The film has the merit of being the first Titanic to show the ship listing. That's something rarely seen in other Titanic media. The sinking scenes were so iconic that the exterior shots would be used in The Unsinkable Molly Brown and The Time Tunnel. Once again, I can't fault the movie for not including the breakup, as this was made at a time when it was believed Titanic sank in one piece. However, I can fault the siren that plays throughout the entire sinking. Had there actually been a siren on board that night, maybe more people would have realised the danger and gotten on lifeboats. But this might have caused the panic that the ship's officers were trying to avoid. We take for granted there being sirens in an event of an emergency telling us to evacuate a place, but Titanic didn't have this luxury. In fact, the sinking was kind of one of the reasons why evacuation sirens became commonplace, because communication was so bad that night. I have found that one of my pet peeves is a Titanic movie that just says, all the boats are gone, when we all know that was not the case. They didn't just launch all 20 lifeboats and be like, well, that's it for us lads, time to gather on the deck and die nobly. There were 2 collapsibles on either side of the ship that people were desperately trying to launch until the bridge was submerged and the boats drifted off. There were some... Alan, please don't put your head right under the microphone. There were some on board who might have taken death on the chin, but the majority were fighting, kicking and clawing to stay alive and hang on. In the film, we get something similar to the ending of Atlantic, where characters gather together and sing Nearer My God to Thee. However, just as you start feeling sad, there's an explosion from the bowels of the ship as she slips beneath the waves, and the singing is replaced with screams that are smothered by the ocean. And then the movie ends. The film doesn't have much of a denouement. We get a glimpse at the real-life people on Titanic as well. I already mentioned J.J. Astor, who seems to show up all the time, although Madeline seems to be in her 30s. Molly Brown is replaced with a woman named Maud Young, who does pretty much all the stuff we expect Molly Brown to do. Once again, we have no Thomas Andrews, and even Ismay is absent for this outing. But as usual, we have Captain Smith. And Smith seems to bear the blame for the disaster, as he's just chilling in the first-class dining room, listening to some young'uns singing around the piano, including Annette and Griff. Have I been calling him Griff? Oh, his name's Giff. I don't know anymore. It's a stupid name. And I believe there was a discussion about how they should have hit the iceberg head-on, but kind of wasted. There is little narration to close the film at the end, although the narrator, Michael Rennie, later went on to play Captain Smith in the first episode of The Time Tunnel, and the actor who played Charles Lightoller, Edmund Purdom, who was uncredited for this film, later voiced the cat in Legend Goes On. One more thing that makes this film unique is that there is no background music throughout. No dramatic stings, no sappy violins. The only music you hear is diegetic. Diegetic meaning music that is actually being played in the context of the scene, not a background score. Oh, one more thing. I should also mention the costumes, since that's usually a make or break staple with period dramas. If you have ever seen a film made or set in the 1950s, you can tell at first glance that the costumes in this film are based more on contemporary fashion and not the actual 1912 fashions. This might have been done to endear the audience to the film, but you might not notice it if you weren't looking for it. Nonetheless, it is another hint that this film was pursuing its own narrative and style, as opposed to really bringing history to life. I think if you enjoy melodramas and love stories where the main characters are jabbing and spitting at each other in the most passive-aggressive way possible before making it up at the end, then yeah, this is the film for you. Sadly, I'm in that inescapable realm of nerdiness, where if I see something to do with the Titanic, I have to analyse all the elements. I have to look at the costumes and the sets to see how accurate they are. I have to see how the real people were portrayed. I have to consider how the lifeboat evacuation goes and see who lives and who dies, and how they might have managed to survive if they had gone in the water. I also always feel cheated when a story of this calibre does not feature the Carpathia afterwards, because the story of the Titanic doesn't end with the ship sinking. It continues in the stories of those who survived. You ought to see them climb on the Carpathia and try and find their loved ones and try and make sense of what has happened. The film ends with Julia and Annette and Griff, or Giff, whatever the hell his name is, in such high emotion. What did they do next? Where do they go from there? Did Annette and Giff reunite and get together? How do you pick up the threads of an old life? How do you go on when in your heart you begin to understand there is no going back? There are some things that time cannot mend, some hurts that go too deep, that have taken hold. And that was Barbara Stanwyck's Titanic. I call it that because even though Barbara Stanwyck is just the star of the movie, she probably didn't have anything to do with the production. She was pretty famous at the time, and she's pretty much like one of those queer icons, so we call it Barbara Stanwyck's Titanic. That's the only way we can identify it from all the others. Because if I said the 1950s Titanic movie, would you think this movie, or would you think A Night to Remember? So the next Titanic we have will be an episode from a TV series that I've already talked about on this channel, but we're going back to that TV show and we're talking about it all over again. If you can guess from the teaser image, good for you. If you can't, have fun guessing. You probably won't be able to get it. This TV show came out in the 60s. No, it's not Doctor Who. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next video. And make sure you share the video around, share and comment and all that stuff, just to make sure this video gets popular. And I will see you next time. I've got lots to do.